Australia plans to transform its barren desert into a vast ocean at a cost of $200 billion. The project would cover an area larger than France and Germany combined. If successful, the plan would create a vast new ocean in the heart of the Australian continent, the size of the Great Lakes in the United States. It would be the most ambitious engineering project in human history. By comparison, the cost of a human moon landing program is much lower. The grand plan includes building massive desalination plants along the coast and a pipeline system extending hundreds of kilometers inland. Massive solar power plants the size of entire cities would have to be built, as would pumping stations capable of transporting ocean-sized volumes of water. Filling the new ocean would require about 20 years of continuous work. But why does Australia need such a massive project? To understand, you have to look at the continent's geography. Australia is roughly the size of the United States, but most of its land is desert. 80% of its land is virtually uninhabited. All of its major cities are located in a narrow strip along the coast. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth all border the sea. And in its center, in an area the size of Texas and California combined, fewer people live than Los Angeles. Central Australia is a climate nightmare. In summer, temperatures soar above 45 degrees Celsius, and in winter they can drop below zero. It rarely rains, sometimes for several years. The soil is so arid and salty that only thorny bushes grow there. The nearest hospital can be hundreds of kilometers away, and the nearest convenience store dozens of kilometers away. Cell phone reception is available only along major roads. Even a simple bottle of water in the outback can cost the equivalent of a McDonald's meal. Historically, European colonists settled only along the coast. There was access to the sea for trade, a milder climate, and fertile soil. Venturing inland was extremely risky. Many expeditions ended tragically due to water shortages and extreme heat. In the 1840s, the famous explorer Charles Sturt searched for a fabled inland sea in the heart of Australia, but found only a lifeless desert. As a result, 25 million Australians live on a narrow strip of land, and vast areas remained deserted for 200 years. It was as if all of America lived in California and Florida, with the rest of the country a lifeless desert. It is precisely this dead zone that Australia seeks to transform into a prosperous region with a sea in its center. The idea is not new. It originated nearly 100 years ago. In the 1930s, when Australia was experiencing the Great Depression, engineer John Bradfield proposed a revolutionary plan. This man is best known for building the famous Sydney Harbour Bridge, one of the country's icons. In 1938, he presented a project to create an inland sea, later known as the Bradfield Project. The idea was simple. A network of dams, canals, and pumping stations would be built, totaling 2,300 kilometers. Water would be diverted from tropical rivers in North Queensland to Lake Eyre, a vast salt pan in the center of the continent. The lake is 15 meters below sea level, so the water would flow there naturally. Bradfield promised fantastic results. The new sea would change the continent's climate. Green fields would appear, as would new cities and hydroelectric power plants. The project would create thousands of jobs and make Australia an agricultural superpower. During the Great Depression, this idea seemed like a real lifesaver. Lake Eyre is truly a unique place. It's the lowest point in Australia, a vast salt plain larger than England. Most of the time, it looks like a white salt crust, cracked in the sun. But once a decade, when heavy rains fall in the north, water flows down the rivers, and the lake transforms into a mirror-like surface. A surface that can even be seen from space. Flamingos and pelicans come here to breed. Unfortunately, the water evaporates after a few months, and everything returns to its former glory, its former lifeless state. Bradfield wanted to make this miracle permanent, but engineers quickly ran into problems. In central Australia, the sun evaporates water 10 times faster than rain can replace it. Even with constant replenishment, the lake would become a hypersaline, dead body of water. The cost of the project was astronomical, the equivalent of tens of billions of dollars in today's currency. However, the main problem was that no one knew how to solve the salt problem. In a closed body of water, salt accumulates until the water becomes toxic to all living things. The idea was shelved at the time, but it was never completely buried. Over the next 80 years, the dream resurfaced again. Politicians discussed it again in the 1960s. New proposals appeared in the 1980s, but each time they faced the same problems: physical, economic, and technological constraints. The severe blow that this seemingly life-saving project received was one of the greatest environmental disasters of the 20th century, which occurred in the Soviet Union. The story of the Soviet Aral Sea turned into a nightmare that warned the entire world about what happens when humans attempt to alter nature on a massive scale. In the 1960s, Soviet officials decided to transform the deserts of Central Asia into blooming fields. The idea seemed grand and noble: divert the Amu Darya and Sirdarya rivers, which feed the Aral Sea, to irrigate cotton plantations in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The goal was ambitious: to become the Soviet Union's largest cotton producer, feed the entire country, and earn billions of dollars exporting this white gold. The Aral Sea seemed inexhaustible. It was the fourth largest lake on Earth, larger than Ireland and up to 70 meters deep. The locals rightly called it the Sea: 70,000 square kilometers of blue water, waves, fishing fleets, and resorts along its shores. The Aral Sea was home to 20 species of fish, and fishing villages like Aralsk and Moynak thrived with tens of thousands of residents. Soviet engineers were fully confident of success. They built a gigantic network of canals with a total length of 40,000 kilometers, longer than the Earth's equator. The main canal, the Karakum Canal, stretched 400 kilometers through the deserts of Turkmenistan. Hundreds of thousands of people worked on the construction, using explosives and excavators to dig canals through the mountains and deserts. The first few years seemed like a real triumph. The deserts were already flourishing. Cotton fields stretched to the horizon, crops grew, and the Soviet Union became the world's second largest cotton producer after the United States. New cities, irrigation systems, and cotton processing factories sprang up in Uzbekistan. Officials celebrated humanity's triumph over nature. But as early as the 1970s, the first worrying signs appeared. The level of the Aral Sea was falling faster than expected. The beaches were receding, revealing the seabed. Fishermen in coastal towns watched in horror as the sea receded miles from their landing sites. The salinity of the water rose, and fish began to die. By the 1980s, the tragedy was clear. The Aral Sea shrunk by half. The port of Aralsk was now 40 kilometers from the coast. Fishing boats stood on the dry seabed like monuments to human folly. The salinity of the water increased tenfold. The sea turned into a vast brine in which no life could exist. But the real horror began in the 1990s. The Aral Sea split into several separate bodies of water. What was once a single sea became a chain of salt lakes surrounded by a white salt crust. Winds lifted millions of tons of salt, mixed with pesticide and fertilizer residues, from the dry seabed. These toxic dust storms became a real disaster. The toxic dust was spread thousands of kilometers by the wind, even reaching Europe. Cancer, kidney diseases, respiratory illnesses, and infertility increased dramatically in the region. The infant mortality rate in Karakalpakstan, the region adjacent to the former sea, rose to one of the highest in the world. The economic consequences were catastrophic. The fishing industry, which supported 60,000 people, completely disappeared. Moynak, once a thriving fishing port, became a ghost town in the middle of a salt desert. People left the area en masse, and the population of some areas halved. The climate changed radically. Without the Aral Sea, which moderated the continental climate, winters became colder and summers hotter. Rainfall, which had been generated by evaporation from the sea surface, ceased. The region became a lifeless desert with an extremely harsh continental climate. By the beginning of the 21st century, the Aral Sea had shrunk by 90%. Instead of the world's fourth largest lake, only a few small salt lakes remained. In place of the seabed, a desert called Aralkum, 40,000 square kilometers of salt, pesticides, and toxic dust, was formed. Satellite images revealed the scale of the disaster. Instead of a blue expanse, it was now a gray-white wasteland. Environmentalists describe the disappearance of the Aral Sea as one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history. "This is one of the most horrific disasters on our planet," said UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who visited the region in 2010. It is hard to believe that this is not a natural disaster, but the result of human activity. Repeated attempts to save the Aral Sea have failed. In the first decade of the 21st century, a dam was built that partially rehabilitated the northern part of the lake in Kazakhstan. However, the southern part in Uzbekistan continued to dry up. International organizations have spent billions of dollars on aid programs for the region, but they have failed to restore the lake to its former size. Alarmingly, the disaster was predicted. As early as the 1960s, Soviet scientists warned of the potential consequences. They estimated that diverting rivers would lead to the seas drying up, but the Soviet political leadership ignored all warnings. Short-term economic gains seemed more important than long-term environmental risks. The story of the Aral Sea became a symbol of how grandiose plans to transform nature can turn into a horrific tragedy. It demonstrated that large bodies of water cannot be considered isolated systems, but are connected to the climate, ecosystems, and the lives of millions of people through complex interrelationships that we still do not fully understand. When discussions about reviving Australia's Inland Sea project emerged in the 2020s, environmentalists around the world sounded the alarm. Their main slogan became, "Don't repeat the mistakes of the Soviet Union." The Aral Sea disaster became the main argument against the large-scale Australian project. Australia's plans to create an inland sea initially seemed crazy. For a long time, no one took these dangerous fantasies seriously. But in the 2020s, the idea suddenly made a comeback, and this time, it was more realistic than ever. What had changed? First and foremost, Australia's water crisis had reached a point of no return. The country is experiencing a water catastrophe. Since 2017, Eastern Australia has been experiencing its worst drought in 400 years. This isn't just dry weather, it's the collapse of water systems on a continental scale. Imagine Tamworth, a city of 60,000 people, more than some European capitals, was about to run out of water. Its reservoirs were 90% dry. Residents stood in kilometer-long lines for drinking water, brought in by army tankers from other states. People were washing from buckets, doing their laundry once a week, and children hadn't seen a full bathtub in months. The situation was even worse in the small town of Stanthorpe. 5,000 people had no running water at all. The central water supply had been completely cut off. Each family received 100 liters of water per day, less than the average American uses for one shower. Imagine cooking, drinking, washing, and laundry, all using 100 liters. People had the choice between a shower and dinner. In rural areas, a real tragedy began. Farmers slaughtered cattle en masse, not to sell them, but because they had nothing to drink. In 3 years of drought, the cattle herd shrunk by 10 million head. That's a third of the country's total. Farms that had been passed down for 150 years were sold for a pittance or simply abandoned. Entire families left the land their great-grandparents had lived on. John McCartney, a farmer from New South Wales, told reporters, "I shot 400 head of cattle last month, not because I wanted to, but because they were dying of thirst. My family has been farming this farm for 70 years. Now I'm the last one left." There are thousands of similar stories. But the real horror came with the 2019-2020 fires, dubbed the Black Summer. This wasn't just a natural disaster. It was the end of the world in one country. An area larger than Great Britain and Ireland combined burned. To understand its scale, it was as if a single fire had destroyed everything from New York to Chicago. 3 billion animals died. Kangaroos, koalas, birds, and reptiles were burned alive. Smoke from the fires rose 15 kilometers, 3 miles, and circled the entire globe. NASA satellites detected the smoke over South America and Antarctica. In New Zealand, the sun shone red due to the Australian smoke. The air in Sydney was more toxic than in Beijing during the worst days of the smog. The economic damage amounted to more than 100 billion, but it wasn't just money that was lost. Entire cities burned. Malakuta became a trap. 4,000 people were trapped by the fire and took refuge on the beach, where they awaited evacuation by military ships. Air temperatures reached 48 degrees, ash fell like snow, and the sky turned orange and black. Firefighters worked non-stop for months, but the blaze was getting stronger. Conventional extinguishing methods didn't work. The flames moved at 80 kilometers per hour, creating fire tornadoes of their own reached several kilometers high. Fire engines melted in the heat, and helicopters were unable to take off due to smoke and turmoil. Even major cities were threatened. Melbourne, the country's second largest city, imposed strict water restrictions. Residents were allowed only 50 liters of water per person per day. That meant 3-minute showers, weekly washing, no gardens, no swimming pools, and no car washes. In some suburbs of Sydney, police patrolled the streets and fined those who watered their gardens. But even these measures were of no use. Reservoirs that were supposed to supply the largest cities ran dry. Warragamba Dam, which supplies half of Sydney's water, was only 40% full. This was the lowest level since records began. Engineers calculated that if the drought continued for another 2 years, Sydney, a city of 5 million people, would be completely without water. Economic losses mounted rapidly. Agriculture, traditionally the backbone of Australian exports, collapsed before everyone's eyes. Wheat yields fell by 20%, causing Australia to lose a significant share of the global grain market. Cotton production fell by 40%, turning entire regions that specialized in cotton into wasteland. Dairy farms were moved closer to the coast, where water was still available. Famous wine valleys were converted to drought-resistant grape varieties or switched entirely to other crops. The tourism industry, which generates $60 billion a year, lost billions of dollars. The Great Barrier Reef, Australia's most prominent tourist attraction, suffered massive bleaching and heat-related death. In the past 5 years, 50% of the reef's coral has died. National parks were closed for months due to extreme fire danger. Foreign tourists canceled trips for fear of fires and smoke. Insurance companies began evacuating drought-affected areas en masse. In some areas, home insurance costs reached $20,000 a year, an amount that exceeds what many families pay on their mortgages. Banks refused to grant loans for property purchases in high-risk areas, which continued to expand every year. Land prices in the central regions fell by 70%. The social consequences were catastrophic. The suicide rate among farmers reached an all-time high, with one farmer taking his own life every 4 days. Psychologists spoke of a depression epidemic caused by the climate catastrophe. Children in drought-affected areas could no longer remember what full rivers looked like. Drought had become their normalcy. Traditional solutions had completely exhausted themselves. Over the past 20 years, Australia had built dozens of new reservoirs at a total cost of $50 billion. The result? They were empty because there was nothing to fill them. Rainfall became increasingly scarce, and when it did fall, the water evaporated before it could reach the reservoirs. Desalination of seawater had some success in major cities, but it was expensive and required enormous amounts of energy. A cubic meter of desalinated water cost 5 times more than conventional water. In addition, desalination plants could only supply water to urban dwellers, posing no problems for agriculture and remote areas, where 30% of the country's population lives. Conserving water at home achieved almost nothing. Even if every Australian cut their consumption by half, it would only offset 5% of the losses caused by drought. The problem wasn't that people were using too much water, but that the available water was actually decreasing each year. Australia was caught in a death spiral. The climate was getting drier, the population continued to grow, and the economy needed water to develop. But water resources were catastrophically scarce. Scientists predicted that the situation would worsen by 2050, with average temperatures rising by 2 to 3 degrees, and rainfall rates declining by 20%. Traditional methods of combating drought were no longer effective, and time was running out to find alternatives. The country needed a radical solution, or risked becoming a barren desert. Against this backdrop, the idea of an inland sea resurfaced. If your house was on fire, you were prepared to do anything to put it out. The most significant change was the technological revolution. In the 1930s, Bradfield had only one source of water, rivers, but they were unpredictable. Pumps consumed huge amounts of energy from coal-fired power plants. Desalinating seawater was expensive, and no one knew how to solve the salt problem. Today, the situation is completely different. Solar energy has become much cheaper than coal. Australia is one of the sunniest countries in the world, and modern solar cells can power huge pumping stations almost for free. Thanks to new membrane technologies, desalination has become much cheaper. Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia already produce billions of liters of desalinated water daily. Technologies are now available to extract valuable materials from seawater on an industrial scale. Modern plants can produce salt and lithium, extract magnesium, and other valuable minerals for export. With the help of computer models, scientists can predict the effects of the new sea on climate and ecosystems decades in advance. This led to the launch of the Australian Inland Sea 2.0 project in 2020. The plan differed fundamentally from Bradfield's. Instead of rivers, seawater would flow. Instead of coal-fired power plants, solar power plants would be built. And instead of trying to avoid salt, it would be extracted industrially. The idea is simple: huge desalination plants, solar power plants, and a pipeline system would be built on the south coast to transport water 600 kilometers to Lake Eyre. If the lake were replenished with salt water and constantly replenished, it would not dry up. The salt could be extracted and sold, turning the problem into a source of income. The project's supporters make strong arguments. The new sea will change the local climate. Evaporation from the surface water will lead to rainfall, lower temperatures, and increased humidity. Within a radius of hundreds of kilometers around the lake, the climate will become milder and more suitable for agriculture. Modern, eco-friendly cities powered by solar energy could be built around the new sea. Tourism could develop. Imagine resorts in the heart of the desert overlooking an endless lake. Agricultural areas with drip irrigation could be created. Factories could be built to process minerals from salt water. The project would create hundreds of thousands of jobs at all stages, from construction to maintenance. It would attract international investment. It would make Australia a leader in renewable energy and desalination. Most importantly, it would help combat the drought that threatens to devastate the country's entire economy. There are also economic benefits. Extracting salt, lithium, and other minerals from seawater is a growing industry. Lithium is used in electric car batteries, and salt is used in the chemical industry. Exporting these raw materials could cover part of the project costs. Solar energy systems around the lake could supply electricity to all of Australia. Surplus electricity could be exported to neighboring countries via submarine cables. Asian countries are already willing to purchase clean energy. New cities in the center of the continent would relieve pressure on overcrowded coastal cities. Property prices in Sydney and Melbourne have reached ridiculously high levels. Most young families cannot afford a home. Cities surrounding the inland sea could become an affordable alternative. Technologically, the project seems realistic. Desalination plants are operating around the world. Pipelines of this length already exist in China and other countries. Solar power plants with the required capacity are being built in Saudi Arabia. Modern pumping stations can pump the required amounts of water. But there are also serious questions. The $200 billion cost exceeds Australia's annual budget. These sums require international funding and decades of political stability. Pipelines of this length are vulnerable to failures, terrorist attacks, and natural disasters. The impacts on ecosystems remain unpredictable. Even the most advanced computer models can make mistakes. Nature is incredibly complex. Salt water could sterilize the soil in large areas around the lake, making agriculture impossible. There are also social problems. For the indigenous Arapana people, Lake Eyre is considered a sacred place. They call it Kati Thanda and believe that the spirits of their ancestors dwell within it. For the Aboriginal people, a flooded lake would be like destroying a temple. Our stories are on this land, said Elder Aaron Stewart. They are written. They cannot be drowned. The project also raises questions about social justice. Australia's central regions are among the poorest in the country, especially for Indigenous people. Spending $200 billion on a mega project while people live without adequate housing, medical care, and education seems ludicrous. Critics point to alternatives. For the same amount of money, thousands of small desalination plants could be built, rainwater harvesting systems improved, water recycling technologies developed, and drought-resistant crops invested in. This approach would be less risky and more resilient. However, proponents argue that small solutions do not solve the problem fundamentally. Australia needs a major breakthrough, not cosmetic measures. The climate crisis requires radical action. The project is currently in the study phase. The government has commissioned detailed studies on environmental impacts, economic feasibility, and technical feasibility. International investment funds are expressing interest, albeit cautiously. Environmental organizations are demanding safety guarantees. A decision must be made in the next few years. If the project is approved, construction is expected to begin by 2030. If it is rejected, Australia will look for other ways to address its water crisis. The Australian Inland Sea Project remains one of the most ambitious and controversial projects of our time. It is an attempt to turn a climate curse into a blessing, a desert into an oasis, and a problem into an opportunity. But the price of error is high, and there are no guarantees of success. The world is watching and waiting. Will Australia take the step that could change its course forever?